Williams farmhouse sat quietly under a gray November sky. The winds whispered through the barren trees, their skeletal branches tapping against the windows like bony fingers. It was Thanksgiving Day, a time usually filled with warmth, laughter, and the comforting scent of a roasting turkey. But this year, the house felt different. It felt colder, emptier. Margaret Williams stood in the kitchen, staring at the familiar chaos around her. Pots clanged, the oven beeped, and her daughters, Emily and Kate, moved frantically from counter to counter. Despite the bustling preparations, there was an unspoken silence between them. It was the first Thanksgiving without John, the family's patriarch. His heart attack earlier in the year had been sudden, robbing them of the man who had held their family together. Margaret wiped a tear from her cheek, trying to hide her sadness as she pulled out an old crystal glass from the cabinet. She poured a generous serving of bourbon into it, John's favorite drink. Carefully, she placed it on the sideboard beside a framed photo of him smiling. He had loved this day, gathering the family together, telling stories from years past. Now all they had left were memories. As the family gathered around the dining table, they decided to set an extra plate in honor of John. It felt right, like a tribute to his absence, a way of making him part of the day, despite the emptiness he had left behind. The meal began in solemn silence, broken only by the clinking of silverware. Margaret looked at the empty chair at the head of the table where John used to sit. It was just a chair now, but in her heart, it was still his seat. She swallowed hard and forced a smile, trying to keep the tears at bay. "Let's go around and say what we're thankful for," Emily suggested, her voice trembling. It was a tradition John had always insisted on. She wanted to honor him, even if her voice wavered as she spoke. Kate was the first. She cleared her throat, staring at her plate. "I'm thankful for the time we had with Dad," she said quietly. Her words hung in the air, the silence that followed almost suffocating. Margaret reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. As they went around the table, Margaret noticed a change in the room. The air grew cold, far colder than it should have been, with the stove and oven running all day. She shivered and pulled her sweater tighter around her, glancing up at the chandelier above the table. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. The family exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. It was as if they all silently understood what was happening, but didn't want to say it aloud. When it was Emily's turn to speak, she hesitated. She took a deep breath and opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. Suddenly, she felt a cold, gentle pressure on her shoulder. A touch so familiar it made her gasp. She turned her head slowly, expecting to see her sister standing behind her, but there was no one there. The sensation lingered, an icy grip that sent chills down her spine. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The room felt like it was holding its breath, the air thick with an unseen presence. The smell of pipe tobacco wafted through the room, sharp and distinct. Emily's eyes widened. She hadn't smelled that scent since her father passed. She looked across the table at her mother, who had her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. The smell grew stronger, filling the room like smoke curling in the air, as if John himself had just taken a seat at the table. Margaret stood up shakily. She looked over at the sideboard, where the glass of bourbon sat untouched. Her breath hitched as she saw it slide across the polished wood, moving slowly and deliberately, as if pushed by an invisible hand. It stopped at the edge, teetering precariously. The family watched, frozen in a mix of fear and longing. Tears streamed down Margaret's face. "John," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If you're here, we miss you. We love you." At that moment, the candle next to his photo flickered violently before blowing out, even though there was no draft in the room. The sudden darkness was suffocating, a reminder of the void left by his passing. Margaret reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the cold, empty chair where he once sat. For a fleeting second, she thought she felt the warmth of his hand on hers, just as he used to do when he wanted to comfort her. Suddenly, the room temperature plummeted. The family shivered as they watched the glass of bourbon rise into the air, suspended as if held by an unseen hand. It tipped slightly, the bourbon spilling out and splashing onto the tablecloth, soaking into the fabric like blood seeping into a wound. Margaret's sob broke the silence. her hand covering her mouth as she watched the liquid pool around John's empty plate. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, drifted through the room. It sounded like John's voice, soft and filled with sorrow. "I'm still here," it seemed to say, carried on a breeze that made the candle flame dance one last time before it died out completely. The lights flickered again, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. The family sat in silence, their hearts pounding, their breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. They could feel him there with them, a cold, spectral presence lingering in the shadows. The moment stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity, and then, as quickly as it had started, the cold lifted. The lights flickered back on, and the smell of tobacco dissipated into the air. The glass of bourbon lay on its side, empty, as if John had taken his last drink. Margaret wiped her tears and took a deep, shuddering breath. She looked at her children, who stared back at her with wide, tear-filled eyes. "He was here," she said quietly. "He came back to have one last Thanksgiving with us." Emily nodded, her voice choked with emotion. "I felt him," she whispered. "He was here, Mom. I know he was." The family sat in silence, holding on to each other, feeling the lingering presence of their lost loved one. They knew it would be the last time he would visit, the final farewell from a man who couldn't bear to leave his family without saying goodbye. That Thanksgiving would forever be etched in their memories. Not just as the first one without John, but as the Thanksgiving when he came back, one last time, to say goodbye. The candle remained unlit for the rest of the night, a reminder of the spirit that had joined them for dinner, leaving behind a cold spot at the head of the table where the warmth of his love had once been.